Hi everyone, welcome to the show, and we are going to pick up where we left off last week on our city tour of Berlin, and we're here at the main church of Berlin, so let's go.
Building, also built by Schinkel, whom I just mentioned as the most important architect we ever had, and this was built, inaugurated in 1830 as the Royal Museum of Berlin. But soon it was noticed that the Royal Museum itself wasn't going to be enough, so another museum was added, and so since they now had two, this became the old museum, and the next one was the new museum. Then eventually a National Gallery also was needed, and it was added, and that's directly in front of you. Again, you can't see much. It looks like a Greek temple. So if you know Greek temples, you know what it looks like. Built by a student of Schinkel, so he learned a lot from his master, of course, the classicist style. Next to the National Gallery is the new museum, but it's almost a shame to use that word because of the condition of the building. It is a perfect example of the criminal neglect of historically valuable architecture in the former East of Germany, even in East Berlin, which was always treated better than the rest of East Germany because it was the capital it had to represent. And nonetheless, this building was near collapsing when the wall collapsed instead, fortunately, so that specialists could come here in the last of moments, really, to secure the ruin before it collapsed entirely, and now they're working on its restoration, same as they're restoring the National Gallery. The National Gallery is closed for renovation and redesign, basically, of the collection. Most of the paintings that were in here are now in the new picture gallery. Now the collection of modern art has to be reassessed and divided up between the two national galleries. Inside the old museum, we just reopened our new antique collection, which is now one of the largest outside of Greece. Again, what I said before, this bringing back together of the scattered collections of Berlin. Inside the new museum, we originally had the Egyptian collection, which is still divided in half and still has to be brought back together. And then finally here to your right, we have the most famous museum of the museum's island, the Pergamon Museum. And the Pergamon Museum is, of course, the oldest architectural museum of the world. Sensational collection of antique architecture ranging from the Pergamon altar, which was discovered by the German archaeologist Humann at the end of the last century in Turkey, via the market gate of Miletus. Miletus was an antique city south of Pergamon, especially grand in the year 200 AD, or the time 200 AD, and then the Procession Avenue of Babylon. That's my personal favorite inside the Pergamon altar, which is 600 BC. Mit der Klimaanlage oder was? Ja, jetzt geht sie wieder. Okay, wir können auch weiterfahren. So that's what's inside the Pergamon Museum, plus, of course, a spectacular antique collection as such. You won't have time for that, obviously, during this visit, but I can tell you one thing: if you do ever think about coming back, it's first of all definitely worth it, and second of all, the visit to the Pergamon Museum is also well worth it. And then finally here to your right is the Bode Museum, named after William von Bode, who was the first general director of all 5 museums on the museum's island. And that also is closed until at least 2001, again for renovation, restoration, and the collections in there were quite mixed. There was a little bit of Egyptian, a little bit of paintings, a bit of sculpting, so obviously all those things are going into other museums eventually. S-Bahn, it's the same S-Bahn. Remember yesterday when I was taking you to the hotel, you saw the big station, Zoological Gardens. This is the same route, same line, yeah? And Friedrichstraße, however, also was especially known during the times that Berlin was divided because it was the biggest border crossing between West and East Berlin. And now the border wasn't here. That wasn't the point. The point was that East Germany, you understand, of course, that most of the subway and city train, a lot of it was built before Berlin was divided. And therefore, at one time, obviously, these lines had to be interrupted, just like everything else was divided. But East Germany upheld 2 lines from West Berlin to East Berlin. So as a tourist, after the German agreements in connection with the 4-power agreements in the early 70s, it became rather normal to be able to visit East Berlin on a touristic basis. It wasn't all that difficult. And so as an American tourist, for instance, you could have flown to West Berlin, and then you could have gotten on a train at the Zoo train station, taken the train to Friedrichstraße, and the only way out of that station would have been through the border crossing. You would have gotten your visa, paid for your visa, you would have been forced to exchange West German money for East German money at a ridiculous rate of 1 to 1. The official rate was 1 to 7. So it was like buying your way into there. Of course, you had to spend the money while you were here, and you had to be back through the same border crossing by midnight. No problem at all by the time I started being aware of this. It was just a hassle, of course. It took time. It was aggravating, but it's not as if it was impossible. I get a lot of tourists that have never been here before that think nobody was able to cross the borders. That's not true. The fluctuation towards the east and back wasn't that difficult because the currency, if you think about it, it's a logical thing. That was a good way to get hard currency.
Well, here we are, Betty. And where are we? We're at the flea market. Everybody wanted to stop for a little bit and go to the flea market.
You know, but it really amazed me that she was surprised that we wanted to do it. I guess we were her first group that ever decided to, let's go to the flea market. Yeah, they're fun.
It is fun. And you know, this isn't the only one we went to. We went to some others in some of the other countries as well. But
look at that. Did you see that?
Yeah, he stuck his tongue out.
Oh, my gosh. There's some weird people every time. Every place you go, you see somebody weird.
Anyway, some of our people did some shopping here, and I'd love to go through these things because you can find some not only rare bargains, but you get a chance to visit with some of the people that are displaying too.
Yeah,
and it's a
I
lot of fun.
enjoy it. I like to see the handicraft work that they do. But this wasn't a real great one, actually.
No, it was just one.
It was
that
a
they had on the
run
map
of the
and
mill,
everything.
and
But it was kind of fun.
But it's fun to walk up and down
Oh, yeah.
and talk to the people,
It
and
is
they all
fun.
speak English.
Yeah, so there wasn't any problem.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just one of the little visits that we had during our city tour of Berlin.
One thing about East Berlin is I could go up unter den Linden, down unter den Linden, and up unter den Linden again, and you'd see fantastic buildings in beautiful shape and think, I never expected East Berlin would be so beautiful. But that's only half of the truth. Because, I mean, look at the facade of the building here to your left. Do you know that you are looking at bullet holes and shrapnel marks from World War II? What does that tell you? That they've been shooting in the streets of Berlin, but what else does that tell you? That East Germany did not lift a finger for more than 40 years. And this almost criminal neglect is unfortunately still very evident once you get away from, the main roads where the tourists were. And it's not that we don't want to fix them up. You can see, obviously, that they're working on the facades like crazy, but there is so much that obviously it can't be done in such a short time. And again, don't forget, East Berlin was the capital of East Germany. It's in a lot better shape than a lot of other parts of what was East Germany. Take a look here to your right. This is the Bode Museum. That's the museum you saw earlier. Here you can see that this is really the museum's island. It's a physical island on the River Spree. I know the river looks a lot like a man-made canal, but it really truly is a river. It's a natural river. It's been controlled by man for centuries, especially here in the inner city, or particularly here, but it is a natural river originally.
That's the river that they're bringing the water into, that we see all these pipes. Does it flow into this river here?
A lot of it does. Or into the canals that go into the River Spree. So indirectly, all of the water ends up here, yes. Remember what I told you about Emperor William II? I told you everything he created had to be overbearing. Well, this is another perfect example. This building to your left in front of us, you know what this is? This is the coach station for the post office as it was built. William II built this for the postal coaches and horses. That's all. And it looks like almost a museum or something even more spectacular than that. And to tell you the truth, that's what it'll be used as in the future. Obviously, we're not going to keep post office items here anymore, but rather they're negotiating with a cultural collection here in Berlin whether they'll be moving into this building. The road that we're standing in front of, or the road that we're on, first of all, is Tucholsky Straße. I don't know if some of you might be familiar with Tucholsky. He was a writer in the early 20th century and a Jew. And we are now turning into a street that was on the edge of the old Jewish quarters of Berlin. And here to your left is a spectacular structure. If you're on the right side of the bus, bother your neighbors. Lean over them, lean across them, sit on their laps. Don't worry about it. But take a look. This is a sensational structure here to your left. This is the new synagogue. We cannot stop because of the security. The new synagogue, ladies and gentlemen, is not new. Don't let yourself be confused by the adjective. The new synagogue, that's a proper name you could say, was new about 130 years ago. And it was one of the most important synagogues in Berlin. You do realize, I hope, and if not, I'm telling you now, that Berlin had one of the largest Jewish communities of Europe. And also, the German Jewish communities, especially in Berlin, were the best established Jewish communities in the history of Judaism. If you consider that all over Europe Jews were persecuted all through the centuries, they never really quite were able to integrate. They always set themselves off from the established communities. But here in Berlin, the Jews in Berlin, the German Jews in Berlin, considered themselves German and then Jewish. But then there was the Eastern European Jewish community that was only coming in not centuries ago, but rather 150, 120, even only 100 years ago, were coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Russia, and other parts of Eastern Europe, fleeing suppression, intolerance, and pogroms. The intelligence in Berlin was shocked to hear what was going on in Russia at the time, not knowing that it would get a lot worse here in Germany, not too far after that. And anyway, so around the turn of the century, in the early years of the 20th century, we had a Jewish community here in Berlin until 1933 of 150,000. Part Eastern Europeans that were new to the city, very Orthodox, strangers to the city, and then part the German Jews that were not recognizable in one single community. But this Jewish community that I was talking about here, that was the Eastern European Jewish community. And that synagogue, however, for the whole community of Berlin, no matter where they were from and how long their families had been in Berlin or in Germany, that synagogue was the cultural and intellectual center of the Jewish community in Berlin. And it was the only synagogue that was not destroyed by the Nazis in Berlin because of the courage of one German Aryan policeman. He was German, he was Aryan, he was a policeman, and yet on November 9th of 1989 he had enough sense of morals to want to stop the Nazis and enough courage to do so. The irony is violence can only be delayed, unfortunately. It was a result of the violence of the Nazis that the synagogue was bombed in 1943. And it was only reopened in 1995, and only the front part is reopened. It's a museum and a Jewish library, not a temple anymore. It's a memorial nowadays. And they've added a Jewish community center. There's an Anne Frank museum I heard about. I haven't been there yet. That was supposedly recently reopened. And what I find very, very positive is that the Jewish community is becoming noticeable again. They're making themselves noticeable. And that is something that I've experienced for the first time and here in Berlin to such an extent. And that's a good sign for the future, of course. Of course, the community is minuscule. It's a tenth of what was here before 33, 15,000 approximately. And ironically, about 1/3 of this group has come from Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union because of intolerance again. In front of us is the Red Town Hall, the Berlin Town Hall. This is the seat of the government of Berlin, the governing mayor, and the Berlin Senate. Has been again since 1990. This is where all three delegations of Berlin were located until 48. The German delegations of the divided city until 1948. West Berlin delegations then left the town hall under protest, went to West Berlin, and then they only came back together into this building in 1990. Then here to your right, we have the St. Mary's Church, or Marienkirche, which was created in 1270. So it's the second oldest church of Berlin. And of course,
TV tower.
Here to your right is the television tower, and the television tower was built in 1969, so it was built by the East German government. It has a height of 368 meters and is therefore one of the tallest structures of Europe. And then here to your right in a moment we have the big station Alexanderplatz, Alexander Square. And the station Alexander Square is also one of the very large junction points. And again, this elevated route is the same one coming from the Zoo station going via Friedrichstraße to Alexanderplatz. That's the most important, most vital vein of public transportation in the center of Berlin.
They all came in for the surprise.
Oh yeah.
Said she never saw so many young people together in all her life.
Oh yeah, they come from all over Europe. We've got 60 trains that have been are running only for the Love Parade, that are not normally scheduled trains. 60 special trains just for the Germans coming into Berlin.
And that's maybe at 2 o'clock.
To your right is the Alexanderplatz, the actual Alexanderplatz. And Alexanderplatz is another of the large squares of Berlin. You could say that in pre-war times it was unequal to Potsdamer Platz, to Potsdam Square, in its traffic, its motion, commotion, and such. Alexanderplatz was also heavily destroyed during World War II, and East Germany then rebuilt it according to their aesthetics. If you look around here, most of the architecture here is typical for East Germany in the 60s and early 70s. And the actual Alexanderplatz used to be a roundabout. If you look at old photographs from the 30s, here to your right, what is now the pedestrian area, that was the Alexanderplatz originally. A roundabout with tram lines crossing each other in every imaginable direction. People like ants in an anthill rushing to and fro along the entire area. And all of that was then covered as a pedestrian area and distorted in its actual design. Alexanderplatz was also subject of a big architectural competition after the reunification, where they dealt with a restructuring of Alexander Square, because of course the aesthetics of the East Germans are not necessarily conform with the aesthetics of the investors today. And so a big architectural competition took place just with dealing with how could a general setup be created, a change in the general setup, not detailing the individual designs, but just how many buildings, how will the roads run, and those kind of things. And the winner of this competition was a German architect, Hans Kohlhoff, and he designed 11 150-meter tall office buildings here, resembling the Rockefeller Center in New York. Something that we've never had here before, and so it's not surprising that they haven't found any investors at all. None. So this is just kind of hanging up in limbo. Nobody knows what'll happen. Here to your right, you've got the town hall again. And also to your right, in front of you, are the twin towers of the St. Nicholas Church, or the Nikolai Church. And the Nikolai Church is the oldest church of Berlin. It was built around the year 1200. Just for your orientation, St. Mary's Church is just behind the town hall from your point of view. Okay, so we are really in the immediate vicinity of the historical center within this center. St. Nicholas Church. St. Nicholas Church, as I said, built around 1200, and around St. Nicholas Church, the St. Nicholas Quarters, that's where Berlin was founded. A very charming little place. You have an organized dinner tonight, so that again might be something for your next visit if you ever come back to Berlin, because there are all kinds of typical Berlin-style restaurants and cafes and sides in the St. Nicholas Quarters.
What's happening over there?
It's kind of weird. You could almost get the impression we're in a police state here in Berlin.
True.
They've really upped security since the government is planning to move to Berlin, much to the chagrin, I must say, of the Berliners. They're not used to that, at least not the West Berliners. But one thing I also should explain is that we have a higher ratio of police per civilian than any other German city. And the reason for that is that under the four powers status of Berlin, we were not allowed to have German government in Berlin. East Germany ignored that, just like they ignored many things that the Allies had agreed. But in West Berlin, we did not have German military, and so instead they increased the police force, and we can't just fire these guys because Germany was reunified. And so it's just going to be a natural selection process that when they're retired, then the numbers will go down. I don't know why they're panicking so much. The government in Bonn is panicked about Berlin. They, for more than 40 years, have been existing in, you know where they're going? They're going to the mint. Where coins are made. I mean, I can see how they would, somebody would rob where the bills are printed, but who's going to rob 10 Pfennig pieces? Because our mint in Berlin only doesn't even make silver coins. It only makes the brown coins. So the biggest coin that we produce is a 10 Pfennig piece. What's that, 7 cents? 6.5? You'd need some real heavyweight weightlifters to carry off enough money out of our mint to make a fortune. I'll tell you that. But maybe, I don't know. I have no idea. Do you know that, by the way, you know the euro, the European currency, the future? Do you know that when the, what do you call them, with which you print bills? The blueprints, basically, the imprints. When they were sent from Germany, the plates, when they were sent from Germany to France, they disappeared. The original set. I don't know what's happened to them, but they're not here.
They are in good hands.
Yeah. Euro isn't even a currency yet. They already have the plates to make counterfeit. Okay, anyway, on a different note, ladies and gentlemen, we're back at the Castle Palace Square. And remember, this is where the castle stood, and you see that the castle is gone, obviously, as I mentioned before. And here to your right, this is what East Germany built instead. This is the Palace of the Republic. And the Palace of the Republic was built as the Parliament building in East Germany, but it also was a public building. There were all kinds of cultural affairs going on inside the building. There were restaurants, cafes, all kinds of stuff. And the building was closed down in 1990 because of asbestos, and has been closed ever since. And the government has been arguing about the future of the building. So far, they've only determined that the asbestos will be removed, and that eventually, then they'll have to assess whether they can renovate the building or whether it'll be torn down. No, this is, ladies and gentlemen, the most beautiful square of Berlin. Just let me explain, and then I'll give you some chance for some more ahs and oohs without windows between you and the rest. In the center of the square, this was the Schauspielhaus. Schauspielhaus is an old-fashioned German way of saying theater house or drama house. And it was built in 1821 by Schinkel. Remember, I keep mentioning him. And this is probably one of his masterpieces. He built this to replace an older church that had been destroyed by a fire, so there is a longer tradition of theater. And this was kept as a theater and actively used as a theater until 1943. Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister under Hitler, was many things, but he definitely was not stupid. He knew exactly what he was doing. And therefore he also realized that the best way to distract people from the real important issues was to keep them entertained. And that meant that the film and theater productions were going a mile a minute, also throughout the war, until they couldn't use the building anymore. So they were acting inside this building until the building was bombed in 1943. And it was then not rebuilt until the 1980s. East Germany reopened the building in 1984, but not as a theater, but rather as a concert hall. Today it's the home of the Berlin Symphonic Orchestra. Remember, you saw the Philharmonic Orchestra Hall in West Berlin, Symphonic Orchestra Hall in East Berlin. In front of the building, Friedrich Schiller is reminding us of the theater tradition. Schiller, of course, along with Goethe, is one of the most important poets in the history of Germany as a whole. And on either side of the Schauspielhaus are two small churches tucked in behind two large domes. A bit behind us are the French church and the French dome, and in front of us are the German church and the German dome. The churches were built in the early 18th century, both as Protestant churches, a Lutheran one for the Germans, a Calvinist one for the French, of course, and the domes were added almost a century later. And the domes, you should know, never really belonged to the churches. The domes were never planned as religious structures. That's something you would assume, and that would be a logical assumption to make. There never was an organ inside these domes or an altar or any of the sort, but rather the domes were always here for ornamental reasons. And that explains why today we have museums inside the domes. The East Side Gallery is the longest piece of the Berlin Wall that still exists today. And it was deliberately left standing while the rest of the Berlin Wall was systematically being torn down. Okay, other pieces then ended up remaining, but this is a piece that really was deliberately left standing from the very beginning, because in the summer of 1990, a big art project was started there. Understand that anyone and everyone could and did walk straight up to the Berlin Wall on the west side, push their nose against it, paint it, write things on it, do whatever they wanted, as long as they didn't destroy it. Then they might have been in trouble. But it was no problem at all from the West Berlin side. In East Berlin, nobody was allowed to approach the wall, much less paint anything on it. In West Berlin, the Berlin Wall was joked about as the longest graffiti exhibition of the world. In East Berlin, the East German government justified the wall as the anti-fascist protection wall. So when the wall came down, artists of Berlin invited artists from all over the world to come to the east side of the wall and to paint the east side of the wall. That was the point, to express the new freedom by painting the wrong side, the Virgin side. And of course, the reaction was spectacular. I mean, I don't think the Berliners expected so many people to come. Originally, they were hoping that everybody could just paint spontaneously, such as the wall on the west side always was painted. There was never any organization to how it was painted or who painted what piece. But the reaction was so overwhelming that eventually they did have to organize it, so that only, I think by lottery or something of the sort, only select few were actually able to paint the wall. And the artists that did paint this East Side Gallery, they of course tried to express their feelings, their opinions about what they were witnessing. Berlin, East-West politics, the world politics, through their art. And that is what you are going to see. Of course, a lot of the East Side Gallery was damaged through time, through weather, through tourists. Even though the wall is under preservation order, tourists ignore that. And it's not enforced by the police, unfortunately. And that means every year a little less of it is left, and you'll see that it's in pretty bad shape, which is kind of interesting because I don't think my generation of West Berliners ever realized how much effort the East Germans put into the upkeep of this border. We just thought, well, it's this solid thing, it's just been there for 28 years, but actually they were constantly fixing it and making sure that it didn't crumble. You'll see that after 9 years of neglect, it's in pretty bad shape now, as you will see. But a lot of the paintings still can be seen, and because it's so long, it'll give you a much better idea of what the city was like with the wall than any of the other smaller pieces that we still have. On our way there, by the way, you'll get a little bit of the harsh reality of housing a la East Germany. Here to your left in front of us, I mean, these white and colorful buildings are pretty nice because of the color, and with the sun shining on them, they're quite bright. But these buildings have just been recently renovated. And if you look beyond them, you've got these I don't know, sludge yellow buildings there. That's the typical housing style of East Germany. Prefab architecture, of course. East Germany was very proud of prefab architecture, and these prefab buildings more or less were built all over East Germany. They have a life expectancy of about 20 years, and they've reached that. They're in very bad shape, and one after the other have to be renovated. Living conditions must be improved inside them. Of course, the aesthetically thinking people would like to tear them all down and build something else, but we cannot do that. We do not have that choice. Hundreds of thousands of people live in these kind of apartment buildings. Where would we put them? Only choice we have is to improve the situation inside the buildings, and that's what's being done. These buildings are not privately owned. Realize when they were built by the East German government, and therefore they were controlled like everything was controlled by the East German government.
Well, Betty, we have to wait until next week to get to the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, if people want to find out about the trips that you have coming up, all they have to do is give you a call at
488-7443.
That's right, and we've got a lot of trips coming up this year, so give Betty a call. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.